Okay, it is 7 o'clock. I'll call this meeting to order of the Kenmore Planning Commission. The first item of business is citizen comments, and we have one gentleman signed up, Dominic Andrilla.
Hi, guys. My name's Dominic Andrella. I live at 18549 60th Avenue Northeast in Kenmore. I attended one of these meetings a couple months back regarding the critical areas reports and the changes that we're considering making to the requirements for homeowners. And I've read through all the proposed changes, and I'm super excited about the changes we're making to our recommendation regarding a tiebreaker. One thing that is not in there yet, and I want to impress upon you the need for, is specifics about when and why this clause would come into effect, and under what circumstances the city would deem a report to be insufficient and require additional review from a third-party geotech. And there are two reasons I think that's really important. One is that it limits my risk as a homeowner, right? I need to know exactly how my report that I submit will be deemed unacceptable so that I can avoid those circumstances. And two, it allows me to have language to hold my geotech accountable, right? If they submit a report to you guys that is deemed unacceptable, and we knew ahead of time what the requirements were and this person didn't meet them, I can hold my own guy accountable as opposed to just being required to foot the bill for another one. So those are, that's all I've got to say about the matter, but I'm hoping that we can add something to the recommendation to that effect.
Great, thank you very much for your comment. Anyone else caring to comment? Okay, the next item of business is the Critical Areas and Shoreline Master Program Amendments memo and attachment. So invite the city staff and consultant to join us. Lori and Amy, I should say there.
Good evening. So we continue on the critical area regulations and shoreline master program amendments. This evening, we're following the same format that we have the last couple of meetings, where you all have reviewed the full set of amendments, and then as we've been hearing from the Department of Ecology and others, we've been bringing forth additional changes. So this is probably the meatiest memo that we've provided to date, and that is mostly because most of the changes are ecology recommended changes. You know that we met with them in early January and spent a couple of hours going over the rules and the proposals, and they had many things that they wanted us to address. I don't think there are any that are really major, but there are enough that this memo contains a lot of amendments. So I started going through and identifying, as I have in the past, the items that we most thought were significant policy changes. And the list is actually quite long. So I can tell you which ones they are, and that may prompt further discussion of them, but I'm not going to go through each one because that, if you don't have questions, it will just take a long time to go through those. So if you want to look at your attachment 1 to the memo, I will just tell you which ones staff thought were the most significant, and you can circle those or identify them, and then if you want me to go into detail on those, I'm happy to do so. Does that sound okay?
Yep.
All right. So on page 2, number 3, related to updating mitigation banking provisions. That again was an ecology recommended change. We're trying to be more consistent with their guidance. On page 4, number 5, this was actually something brought up by the Planning Commission, the question of whether just public agencies should be considered for an exception to the rule or whether nonprofits, churches, et cetera, should be included. The staff recommendation is no, And I'm happy to go into detail about that. Number 7 on the following page, page 5, the new buffers for Swamp Creek Commercial, our new shoreline designation. Number 10, which has to do with a state law that provides relief to some properties. This is I'm not sure that there's really a policy direction here, but it was a significant amount of new text and that I wanted you to see. And then on page 9, numbers 14 and 16. These have to do with overwater structures, floats and moorage buoys in one case, and commercial covered moorage in the other. On page 10, numbers 19 and 20, clarifying who can prepare a landscape plan in the shoreline, and then addressing outdoor storage. We haven't really tackled that subject clearly in the shoreline regulations, and we thought it was important to do that. And then the last few are on pages 14 and 15, and those really have to do with, again, overwater structures, walkway widths, fill for watercraft lifts, and then buffers on the Sammamish River. So as you can see, it's kind of covering all of, or many of the items in Attachment 1. So the commission can decide whether you want us just to focus on those or whether you would prefer that we tackle some specific ones by exception as we have in the past.
Any preference about how we address this?
I would say not specifically the ones that we just mentioned, but by exception overall. I had a few other comments outside of the ones that just mentioned.
I would tend to agree with Mike, and I did have some other comments on other items as well. So, any objections to that? We'll do it by exception as we have. Okay.
Good. All right. We're ready.
Okay. Fire away. Vice Chair Mulcair, would you like to get the ball rolling?
Sure. This follows on to Mr. Odrella, is that pronounced? Odrella. Comments, citizen comments section. This is regarding the tiebreaker language that we're seeing.
It's on page 3. Right, it starts on 3. Right.
Specifically in subsection B,
Mm-hmm.
marked in yellow, which I assume is the new language.
Correct.
Concur with Mr. Andrella's talk about that a little bit. I think maybe it's a little bit more clear from the language here what caused the question that I had was, in the event of a tiebreaker, the applicant shall fund. Is that an absolute requirement? In other words, red flag objection, if the homeowner applicant concurs with that still be
The way it's handled currently, yes, it would. And that is because the city has traditionally taken the position that if we need information, that the applicant is responsible for providing that. So we pay for the city's review, we pay for the city's reviewer, but then if there's a question or there needs to be a revision or a modification, then that is generally charged to the applicant as part of the permit application fee. I mean, it's not written in stone that it has to be done that way, but the city has always tried to recover the cost of having professionals review materials if that's required. So for example, if somebody has to do an environmental impact statement, the city doesn't pay for that, the applicant pays for that. Or if a design has to be redrawn, the applicant pays for that, the city doesn't pay for that. In this case, the city's reviewer would not be expected to request a third-party review unless, in their professional opinion, there was an inadequacy in the report. And so the determination could be handled a couple different ways. If this is a case where if the applicant's geotech wants to amend their report and provide information back, that would be one strategy. If there is no agreement, then you go to this tiebreaker, and then it would be assumed that the applicant would pay.
If there's discussion around it.
Commissioner Vanderline.
Question. When the city reviewer rejects, what's included in that reject? Can you explain why?
I'm sure there is. I don't have a specific case in mind, but again, this is a situation where there's been a geotechnical report submitted, and then it comes to the city, and the city's reviewer is feeling like it is not adequate based on their best professional opinion. So of course, they're going to identify what those inadequacies are. Again, that information would go back to the applicant, and if the applicant said, we disagree, our consultant says this and your consultant says this, then we go to the tiebreaker and get a third party involved.
So just so I'm clear, in that situation where the applicant has now received communication from the city that details out why they feel the application is insufficient or defective, the applicant then has, before going to a third arbiter, the applicant has the option of amending or asking their geotech to amend, and so that you could have an iterative process
Right,
before you
correct.
go to the expense of a third
Correct.
arbiter. And you would only go to the third arbiter if for some reason there was you weren't able to come to a technical agreement.
Conclusion,
on the
right. I could give you, maybe it would help if I gave you an example from the wetland requirements. So sometimes we receive wetland reports, and we have generally lists of what critical areas reports should include. So we have a critical areas report. The reviewer looks it over and says, well, I don't think that they considered this. And so then the person who prepared the wetland report may revise their report and resubmit it. In a case where the applicant's wetland consultant says, no, you are wrong, I totally disagree with you, the boundary of this wetland is here, and the city's reviewer is saying, no, it is not, it is here, then we go to the trouble of getting a third-party reviewer to make the determination, because there's a dispute and we need a third opinion, basically. It would be the same with the geotech report.
Just a question. So if there is an iterative process, how frequently does this come up that it actually goes to a third party? Whether it's wetlands or anything else, I'm just trying to get some sense
Yeah,
of that.
I
mean, is
think-
this a once in, 10, once in?
Right. So I don't work in development services, so I'm not going to have complete knowledge of this question. Anecdotally, I think I probably know of a couple of times in
in-
probably the last 5 years, 8 years, where I've heard that a third-party report was being required because there was a fundamental disagreement over it. But if you want exacting information, I need to get that information
I
for
just wanted to
you,
get a
and I'm
sense.
happy
That's
to do
fine.
that.
No, a sense is fine. Okay, I guess we can move on to other topics in the amendment. Anyone else have issues they'd like to, questions, concerns? We'll start with Commissioner Greathouse.
Okay, I just had a question about under 3, Section 3, the critical area regulations, the mitigation banking. So in the previous version, the term "the city" was used, and it looks like that's been replaced by the city manager. And also, there was a mention of the comprehensive plan, that decisions needed to be aligned with that. And I don't see that in the new wording. And so I'm just curious what parameters are restricting the city manager's determinations, or how is that supposed to work differently than what was in place before?
Right. So the city manager question is an easier one to answer. Throughout the code, we typically assign a duty to someone. And if the term city is used, that actually means the city council. They're the ultimate policymaking body of the city. The city manager is a defined term that says the city manager or his or her designee. And we are, in fact, right in the middle of the process of going through all the code sections and formalizing that. It, for the most part, has been clear, but there have been a few cases where it was unclear. So I think the change from city to city manager was just to reflect that that's something that would be done administratively rather than through the city. There wouldn't be a city council decision happening. That the city manager would take on the responsibility of determining whether the bank was appropriate.
Had there been a city council decision required previously?
No, this mitigation banking language, I believe, was brand new. Is that, the old language was brand new.
I think there was some, sorry, I'm not even on. There was some language before, and then I think we suggested revisions to it, and then upon further review and looking at Ecology's more recent suggested language, we thought that language seems to work better. It's simpler. The old version had references to various banking rules and banking acts, the Federal Register, and things that sort of evolve and can change over time. And so Ecology's proposed language sort of eliminated some of those specific references to other documents and just kept it more simply that it's state certified, which is a pretty rigorous process to become state certified. So it sort of handles a lot of those code and law consistency issues just on its own. As far as the comprehensive plan consistency, I think that's kind of a given with mitigation banking and using these kind of watershed-based solutions for mitigation rather than doing the piecemeal approach. So it sort of has been predetermined to be consistent with the comprehensive plan, so it didn't seem necessary to call that out as something that's especially needed to be considered with each application. Does that make sense?
Okay.
The bank itself, when it is, so this language merely says if there is a bank, you can participate in the bank. The creation of the bank itself would be something that would be reviewed through, for example, the comprehensive plan. There aren't any banks in Kenmore, but if there were someone to propose a bank, certainly that would be a review it would be like a land use action that would require a review.
Okay, great.
Does that
Thank
help?
you. That explains it. Yes,
Okay.
thanks.
Great. Commissioner Vanderline.
Yeah, just a little background on what a mitigation bank is. Is this actually a financial account in which dollars are contributed, or is there some physical mitigation that's attached to that? You're shaking your head.
Yes. Well, it's both. So typically, and it's a lot of private commercial interests have taken on developing these mitigation banks, and so they do all the upfront work of constructing a very large, typically, mitigation site with restored wetlands and floodplains and wildlife habitat and that sort of thing. And then they go through a process where they get it certified, and it involves state and federal agencies and tribes and a number of other parties. And then once it's been approved and constructed, then they can start selling credits to it. So it's kind of like mitigation that's been developed in advance, and then someone fills a wetland within the service area of that bank, and they need to do mitigation, then they can purchase X number of credits from the bank, and that sort of wipes out their impact. And all of the details of how the bank works and how much a credit costs and how much wetland impact is worth and how many credits you have to buy per a certain type of impact is all laid out and negotiated as part of a mitigation bank instrument that's approved by the agencies before they can sell their first credit. So there's a number of them under development. I think the closest one right now, and I'm not sure if it's maybe a year or two off, is the Keller Farm Mitigation Bank in the city of Redmond on Bear Creek. So that service area for that facility will likely include Kenmore. There's other programs which are not part of mitigation banking, but there's a couple other ways that you can pay money to in lieu fee programs, which work similarly, except that they don't pre-construct the wetland mitigation.
A developer would purchase credits, dollars would go into a city account.
It would go to the owner of the bank, because they're the ones that have invested all the dollars and constructed wetland mitigation, and then they're reimbursed basically by applicants who have wetland impacts, and then they sort of can wipe out their own impact by transferring money to the bank, and once the bank sells all of its credits, then it's done, and then it will just continue to be maintained in perpetuity. So there's a lot of long-term maintenance agreements and monitoring requirements that protect the mitigation bank site for 99 years and more. Sure.
So yeah, I wanted to follow up a little bit on that. So if I understand this right, the service area is or could be beyond the jurisdiction of the affected the project in question.
Yeah, typically a mitigation bank service area, and this is to some degree also part of the negotiation, would include a watershed or several subbasins in a watershed. I know like the Skagit River watershed is divided. There's mitigation banks that serve the lower and the upper and that sort of thing. But yeah, so if there's an impact in Kenmore, if you purchased credits from the mitigation bank, the actual mitigation might take place in the city of Redmond.
Would it be feasible? I see how that works, and it probably isn't even possible to have it required. But would it be possible to express a preference for mitigation projects to be done within the jurisdiction of Kenmore, since the impacts are within Kenmore? I mean, it sounds like they have their setup, and they do what they do. But I'm just wondering about how that might be. Whether that's even a possibility.
Yeah, this is part of, there's sort of a hierarchical preference for mitigation, and in the earlier parts of the regs, it talks about on-site in-kind, when those are not available or they're not, it would end up resulting in maybe a postage stamp sort of mitigation, and it just doesn't ecologically make sense. Then you kind of work your way through the hierarchy, and eventually it might be that you end up at purchasing credits from a mitigation bank, and that's sort of a watershed perspective, and it serves sort of the greater ecosystem, even though the city of Kenmore or a particular sub-drainage in Kenmore might effectively sort of lose that particular
Right, I get it, we're
function.
part of a larger ecosystem.
Yeah.
So you're saying that there in most, if not many cases, the impacts would be mitigated in Kenmore based on the hierarchy.
The hierarchy.
of
Yeah, and it's getting a little complicated if you were to have actual direct wetland impacts, because currently the Corps of Engineers and to some degree Department of Ecology are operating under a federal mitigation rule, which currently says that mitigation for wetland impacts must take place in a mitigation bank first if it's available, then an in lieu fee program, and then they work their way the other direction from current city code and Ecology's current guidance. So there's a bit of a disconnect there, and I've talked with Ecology about like how are applicants supposed to resolve that, because you do it one way and then you might end up with issues with the Corps of Engineers when you're trying to permit your mitigation project. But I think the way it's kind of set up now at least gives you the most flexibility possible. I think applicants are going to have to work through that process and just see where things end up.
Right. Well, that being said, could we do a policy preference for, mitigation banking within Canada? If we express that, what would be the
I don't
potential
think,
consequences?
you could propose it, but it's probably more effective on a case-by-case basis when we're asking people to mitigate on their site. That's always the first preference, and that's what we try to achieve. So the very first goal for review in the city is to mitigate on the same property or in the same local area. So you would only, and that's already in the regulations. So this is just an alternative if that, for whatever reason, and the reasons Amy described, was not feasible. Now, in terms of inviting someone to do a mitigation bank in Kenmore, I suppose there's no reason we couldn't, but those are not something that an individual applicant would take on. It's a specific group or an agency that does a mitigation bank, right?
It's usually like I think Habitat Bank LLC is one of them, so it's kind of it's a business, and their business is developing mitigation banks, but they generally take a good chunk of land area. The price has to be right so that they can ultimately make money off of it. So it'd be difficult to probably find that sort of space in Kenmore that would be economically viable. There probably, if you wanted to keep mitigation for impacts in Kenmore, a better option, and this would still be under development, would be using King County's in lieu fee program. That's the program where you pay money in, they collect the funds, and then they implement projects on their roster. Right now, there aren't any projects in Kenmore, but King County is really hoping that local jurisdictions might say, hey, we've got a potential really great project. We'd be interested in talking with you about developing it in Kenmore. And then that might be available to applicants in Kenmore to do their mitigation that way. So,
Commissioner Vanderleide.
Thank you, that helps a lot. When I was reading this, one of my big issues was I was trying to understand the difference between the in lieu of, which we've used before, for instance, in affordable housing and others, and this proposal. So I could see where we, being Kenmore, would have a preference for in lieu, where we would have a project list that we could control that would be within Kenmore versus a mitigation bank as it's described here. So I'm struggling with why we would want to introduce this idea, or if we, I think you were going, Mark, if we were to do that, how do we make sure that the benefit stays within Kenmore?
Yeah. It may be,
The only way I can think of it is either you don't include this, or
Yeah.
you have something that says we're going to encourage, or Kenmore is going to become the mitigation bank with Kenmore as the service area.
yeah, now, again, that would be
I know,
really
it's-
difficult. But I think the best strategy is probably to stick with the hierarchy you have now with the preference and having applicants demonstrate why Insight and On-Kind won't work. And then, again, partly because of pressures from like the Corps of Engineers, it's good to leave applicants with some sort of a pathway where they can develop their property and do their project and have some sort of a viable mitigation solution. And if
Our
you shut the
current
door on
hierarchy-
banks and in lieu fee, then applicants, some of them might just be kind of stuck.
So does our current hierarchy, as it's established today, provide that level of protection, where you would go to something like in lieu would be toward the top of the list, if not the top of the list, and mitigation bank would be an option toward the bottom of the list?
I don't think it says that specifically, but I think, we could certainly do an introduction that would make it clear what the first in-kind and on-site, it's clear. That's the first priority. But if you can't do that for whatever reason, and you have to justify that, then we could, in these sections that talk about alternative mechanisms, we could be more explicit and say that our first preference is always to have our mitigation in the city
Yeah.
drainages, is that what we would
Yeah,
say?
and the
And then
drainage basins or.
first choice would be in lieu fee, second choice is mitigate.
Yeah.
Does that make sense, Amy?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
would
we could do that.
recommend or suggest that we do that. I've seen in both state and federal code where you have actually an algorithm that says that your first consideration is the first item on this list and you work your way down.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably would get us where we want to be
Yeah.
here. I'm particularly concerned because Kenmore is such a small jurisdiction. It's going to be very
Inclusive.
difficult to be able to maintain that value, and if you immediately go, we have somebody from outside who wants to have create a large area, as you said, as a for-profit enterprise, to create that area, we could be subsumed into it unless we have some protection that does make that a potential option. We could see our mitigation dollars flowing out of here.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach too, laying out the scenarios and how they're followed. So anybody else have a opinion on that particular issue?
I just had a follow-up question. Do we have an infrastructure for in lieu fee
Like
compensation
a
for,
city program specifically?
No.
No.
not for critical area mitigation?
Right. So
No,
right
it
now, I
was-
think King County is
Okay.
got their umbrella program that jurisdictions and applicants can use.
Which doesn't sound that different from a watershed-oriented mitigation bank.
Yeah, and the real difference between the banks and the in lieu fee is the banks are constructed first, and then they sell the credits once it's been built. And in lieu fee, typically, there's a suite of projects, and they collect the money and then do the project. So it's kind of a sequencing issue and a cost issue as well. Mitigation banks, generally speaking, if they build it first, it might cost you a little more, but you're also having to buy less because it's already proven and constructed, and there's not as much risk. So you don't have to buy as much mitigation as you would if you were constructing it yourself. You might have to do a lot more because they're like, I'm not sure that's going to work, and we need time, and those types of things. So you end up doing more.
So did I see a majority of heads nodding that you want us to make those priorities clear, or?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, great.
Other questions, thoughts on, again, we're doing this by exception, so we may, bounce around a little bit, so the floor is open to those.
I had a question on page 4 around section 5, the public agency and utility exceptions.
Sure.
It all looks fine. The only question I had is in the final paragraph regarding churches and other nonprofits, and I don't have the definition in the Growth Management Act memorized, so I can't say exactly what those definitions are, but I was wondering about instances where a church or a nonprofit is serving what I might consider a public facility or use service. So I'm thinking about things like temporary or emergency housing that a church may provide, or food banks, or even park and ride services, which I think some of the churches in the downtown corridor provide.
Right.
Are those mutually exclusive?
I think for purposes of this PAUE, they probably are mutually exclusive. And I noted in the cover memo that we had received, do you remember we held a forum in September with a number of agencies about the public agency and utility exception? And then there was a paper written, and that material went out to the agencies, and the response back is probably going to be different from what we had anticipated, and that's why it's not coming back to you until the end of February. I think that from the agency's perspective, this particular kind of an exception has to be very narrowly structured. And so I don't think we're even going to achieve it for public agencies generally. It may be just expansions of public agencies. And I certainly don't think we get be given any opportunity to go beyond what's clearly a public agency. I mean, I think that's just the reality of the situation. So they may serve, I'm sure many do, serve public, do good things for the public, but that does not make them a public agency. So.
I had a couple things. Maybe start, and they're not going to, I don't think, take too long, but you mentioned, I think, the buffers on, I believe it was page 7? can you just tell us a little bit of how you arrived at those numbers? I had the same question on the numbers, the buffers on page 15. Let's see.
Are you
Yeah,
talking
so
about
what, yeah, so if you could just talk a little bit about the buffers and how you arrived at those numbers on page, I guess, page 15 in the copy of the amendment one and on page 7.
We have it on page 5, the buffers for Swamp Creek Commercial.
Let's see here. What page?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right,
that's
but
one of
also
them.
under
And the
7.
And the other was Swamp Creek Commercial, and the other was,
Right,
Yeah.
the other
so
was,
number 7
Sammamish River.
on
yeah.
page 5 is Swamp Creek Commercial, and then 15 is, on page 15 is are the other buffers, so.
So hitting number 7 first on page 5, it's a very small area that we've designated now as Swamp Creek Commercial, so it was pretty easy to zoom in with Google Earth and kind of get some measurements of what is the existing functioning riparian corridor adjacent to the stream. And then there's pretty hard, firm edges of concrete right next to that functioning area. So the numbers of the 50 and 60 feet that are proposed here basically recognize that existing condition and provide just a little bit more flexibility for those particular uses that may be water-oriented versus the non-water-oriented uses. And so that's where we kind of drew a line between the 50 and for water-oriented and 60 for non-water-oriented. But that was kind of a good fit based on what's out there right now.
And I might just jump in and say Swamp Creek Commercial, as you recall, is that little area like where the Starbucks is and now the preschool. It follows along the west side of Swamp Creek. There's one parcel on the other side, but primarily on the west side of the creek.
And then on page 15, so this is really a change for particularly the water-oriented parks and outdoor recreation facilities. And at the request of parks, we were exploring whether or not we could try a zero buffer or a no buffer sort of option for parks and just develop those detailed kind of performance standards and design guidelines and let parks operate that way. That was a method that had worked in the city of Chelan, for example, with their parks, which are very, generally in Chelan in particular, they're very narrowly confined in between a highway and then the water's edge, so quite constrained, and you have to do a lot with little space. So we were trying a similar approach, kind of adapting from that. Ecology was really uncomfortable with the level of protection and didn't have the confidence that that was needed or that it might be implemented in a way that would appropriately protect the resource. So in lieu of that, we decided to develop, go back to a kind of a traditional numeric standard, and then still combining that, though, with a list of uses or sort of some guidelines on uses of things that could still happen in that buffer to make sure that appropriate water-oriented public access and recreation could be accommodated within those park resources. Sort of the numbers themselves, like 50 feet for shoreline residential, and for the most part, that's not even really an issue because I don't think we have too many water-oriented parks in the shoreline residential designation, or we would have designated it urban conservancy. But urban conservancy being the 100-foot designation, but then again, like I said, there's a long list of uses that could be allowed in that buffer, and we think sort of a mix of a protective buffer to make sure that things that aren't water-oriented and truly belong in a park close to the river or close to the lake are going to be farther back from the water's edge, and leaving that inner 100 feet for truly water-oriented access and recreation, as well as environmental and ecological benefits. So that was kind of our thinking there.
Okay, thanks
And
very much.
I might also point out that we added Swamp Creek Commercial into this table, but there's no frontage of Swamp Creek Commercial on the Sammamish River, which is why it says NA, not applicable, just for clarification.
So, last question I had to do with, let's see, it's on page 16 under that same section, reconsider buffers on the Sammamish River. It's on the next page from the table of buffers. It has to do with the parking, and I know there's, I just wonder if there's any limit on the number of parking spaces in these parking requirements, or are these other items are basically how parking is sort of regulated in
Yeah,
terms of the footprint of the parking?
We didn't put any like stall number limits or square footage limits in here. Still trying to leave a little bit of room for recognizing that some parks might need 10 and some might need 50 or 2. So for maximum flexibility, just try to have performance standards and then leave it to Parks Department to make their case for how many stalls they might need and where they should
Okay,
be
so it'll be
located.
very case-specific based
Yeah,
on the
yep.
site and
Yep.
access and all that?
What's there now, what
Uh-huh.
they need, and where there's room.
Okay. And the city will ultimately, I guess, make a determination of what will be the parking lot size in terms of stalls then?
Yeah, the zoning code has standards for parking sizes, and so we would use those same standards in the shoreline.
Okay.
Yeah.
One more thing I want to mention too, I'd kind of forgotten about. Another change and is in the residential development category of buffers on the Sammamish River. And there's a new footnote 6 that's shown in the table, and that's at the very bottom of page 16. We had proposed a shoreline buffer of 15 feet on that one reach of the Sammamish River that has the mobile home park on the north side. And ecology was concerned that, well, what if, in 10 years, 20 years, a different use comes in altogether and it's redeveloped? Are they going to get that 15 feet? So we kind of wrote a provision that locks in the 15 feet still for the mobile home park, but if and when it changes use, that the buffer would then jump up to 75 feet, consistent with sort of the adjacent, what's it called again? Lake Point development provisions, so that there's a little more consistency there. But then we also added an opportunity to reduce the 75-foot buffer in that case down to 50 if they implemented enhancement and some public access. So trying to get a good balance in there and make sure that the mobile home park has its 15-foot buffer as long as it's there.
That's all I had. Any other comments, thoughts? Commissioner Lucis, go ahead.
So reading through this, on page 11, section 20, subsection 3, this applies to outdoor storage in the downtown waterfront environment. Subsection 3 says storage shall be maintained in a neat, orderly, and safe manner. Is there a definition for those terms, especially because the downtown waterfront includes the premix I know down there?
Right.
And having something neat, orderly, and safe should kind of be explained, or at least
Yeah.
something that kind of connects with the premix down there.
Yeah, we don't have a definition of those. This language parallels the language that's in the zoning code.
Okay.
So it would be a judgment call, I think. I'm not quite sure. Safe, we could probably figure out easily. I think neat and orderly it probably is a judgment call, depending on how things are laying across the site. So the Development Services Director or the Code Enforcement Officer would be the one to call, or if we had usually those are enforced on a complaint basis. If we got a complaint, it would be
Okay.
handled that way.
So it's only found later on, there's no definition if they were to establish a new outdoor, an outdoor storage facility.
Right, so those particular uses are what are called nonconforming. So they're not currently permitted uses. So if they wanted to expand, if they wanted to add more outdoor storage, the answer would be no, unless somehow they received a conditional, it's called a conditional use permit. So they would have to go through a permit review process in the city, and they would, whatever their proposal was, would have to be in sync with the comprehensive plan, and that would not be in sync with the comprehensive plan. So I guess for the premix site, I guess I'm just suggesting that new expanded outdoor storage there is not something that would be permitted, because the outdoor storage has to be associated with accessory to a permitted use, and it wouldn't be in that case. That doesn't help with your concern about neat and orderly, and I don't know if the commission has other suggestions, or I think the idea behind this language when it went into the zoning code was just that we didn't want haphazard piles of junk laying all over a site, that if somebody was actually going to use it for outdoor storage, it should be like Plywood Supplies outdoor storage, which is very orderly and is on a surface that doesn't create a lot of mud that gets tracked on city streets and that kind of thing.
Okay.
But we can, we can pursue that if the commission wants us to put more words around that.
I think that's a valid suggestion, yeah, to see if there's a way to make it a little clearer, a little neater, a little more orderly. So it sounds like there's obviously subjectivity involved, but to the extent we can make it clear without being too prescriptive.
Thank you.
I might take a look at some other codes in the area and see what language they use. They may have some good ideas that we
Yes,
could
thank you.
expand on that.
Anything else?
I had a quick question on section 16 on the bottom of page 9. This is the section we talked about in the introduction about the limitation on covered moorage. The section heading says that this is a limitation on commercial covered moorage, and my question is this only applicable to what we might consider commercially zoned districts, or could this also apply to shoreline residential? In other words, is the commercial part of this defined by the use, or is it defined by the zone?
It's defined by the use, but the use should match what's allowed in the zone. So if it didn't match, for example, if you had a commercial operation in shoreline residential, chances are that, again, would be a nonconformance. And so the notion, if they wanted to cover it, would probably not be okay, because it would be an expansion of an existing nonconformance. So the two kind of work together. It's most likely that this commercial covered moorage would come up in an area where those uses are allowed, probably downtown waterfront. But you could have a nonconformance in another area. I'm not aware of one, but there could be one.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, okay. Amy was going to talk real briefly about, last meeting, we talked about the shoreline designations. And again, based on some more conversation, we're suggesting, is it 2 changes or just the one change?
Really just the one.
Yeah.
Couple of corrections, which we mentioned last time as well.
Right. So anyway, Amy has the revised map that we were going to show you, and then talk about this one change. So I'll call it up. We hope it's going to call up.
Oh, well,
There it is. Oh,
Okay.
good.
So, and this is a change, this is a subject that we heard about in public comment during the last Planning Commission meeting as well. And originally, we had proposed to change Squires Landing Park property, all of it, to Urban Conservancy on the north side of the Swamp Creek. And based on some feedback and looking at existing conditions and the city's current kind of proposed plan and future for that area, it made sense to split the park and along a parcel line, so it's not a completely just draw a line somewhere, that there's some parcel lines in there which we use. But now we're proposing only to change the kind of potential active planned part of the park to urban conservancy, and then retain natural for the rest of the park property headed east and up towards the highway. So that's the major change. A couple other things we just talked about last time that I sort of caught while we were looking at the map together was cleaning this up and making sure that this little corner wedge here was called out as being part of shoreline jurisdiction. It's definitely wetland. So that has been added. And I think there was another area, maybe it was up here, that was clearly wetland, and we made sure that that was captured. And then the final change was somehow in the last back and forth in GIS, this parcel was natural, and it ended up becoming urban conservancy, and we've returned it to natural. Those were the only changes to the map, proposed changes. Questions on any of those? Hey, great.
So the only other item that I had was just to talk about upcoming meetings, just because those have been shifting. I'm so sorry about this. So originally, when we were planning our approach, we had hoped to come to you on February 2nd with our final sort of package of amendments, and then we talked about holding the public hearing on February 26th. You may remember that we had decided to do that because of the city council timing that was going to be following that. The comments that we received on the public agency utility exception, and perhaps more significantly, the comments that we received from FEMA on our mishmash of the frequently flooded areas regulations mean that we cannot get those changes to you at the beginning of February. I will say that FEMA had that mashup starting last November, so we gave them a lot of time. Unfortunately, we didn't receive their comments until a couple of weeks ago. I know they're very busy, but it's going to push back our schedule. So the consultants were meeting tomorrow morning, in fact, to go over all the changes that were requested and figure out our strategy for that. And then we anticipate bringing those changes to you on February 26th. So that means for February 2nd, we're recommending that you cancel your regular meeting, your first meeting in February. And then February 19th, you had already talked about canceling. We had already decided that that was an evening the city council might take, and so we had changed it to the 26th. So the first suggestion I have is that you cancel your February 2nd meeting. And then in March, so March 5th is your regular meeting, and that's the meeting we hope to bring the final packet to you. Then the next meeting, March the 19th, is the short course. And so March 26th, we're hoping to have a special meeting to finish off the public hearing.
Okay,
So-
so you need sounds like you need a motion to
Cancel
the-
February 2nd, and then I'd love to hear whether we would have a quorum on March 26th.
I'll make a motion to cancel. It's actually February 5th. That's our first meeting in February, not the 2nd. But I make a motion to cancel the February 5th meeting, the first Tuesday of February.
I'll second. Also, thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a motion and a second to cancel the February 5th meeting of the Planning Commission. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries unanimously. And then, so you need our plans for March 26th.
Right,
Okay.
correct.
Anybody know that at this point they will not be here?
I will not be here.
Anyone else at this point know they won't be here? I won't be here on March 5th, but it sounds like. Good. So it sounds like we presumably will have a quorum on March 26th. So you need to set the public hearing.
We'll be talking
in-
about that. You know, we still have a ways to go.
Yeah.
And we talked about, well, just scheduling it that first meeting in April, but that's really pushing it close to when you can get to council, maybe at the end of April, and then they have a very short window to do their review. So we're being squeezed on both ends because, as you know, we have to adopt by June 30th.
June 30th, right?
Right. So we're trying to give them
Okay.
maybe 3 meetings to feel comfortable.
The
with
council.
The council,
Okay.
right. And I will say, we talked about the docket last night, and they did approve, I think last time we talked about what we anticipated they would approve for 2019, and they did approve that. So it'll be finishing this project, the parks plan, ADUs, and then incentives to office development. So they did settle on that. But also at that meeting, I really encouraged them to follow along with your materials. They get copies of your materials because I explained that this is a vast amount of amendments and that they might, if they have time, of course they don't, but that encouraging them to try maybe to get a little bit ahead on this particular topic because it's complicated and they're not going to have a lot of time.
Lori, so last night, I believe I heard that there was an alternate docket item as well.
So the alternate docket item is it's called the capital facilities element, and that is the city's capital plan. That doesn't have to fall into the regular process.
Okay.
And we don't have to amend the capital facilities plan. We haven't amended it except once last year since 2015. But if there's a significant new project added or removed from the plan, then we have to go back and amend the element.
Okay.
I don't anticipate that, but I just put it on there as a placeholder
All
in
right, thank you.
case we needed to.
Is there a particular order of these 3 other docket items, just out of curiosity, that we'll be addressing? Do you know?
Right. I think, and the parks planner and I haven't sat down and sketched out meetings, but I anticipate that we'll probably trade off topics so that maybe one meeting you'll talk about parks and then the next meeting you'll talk about ADUs. I think that will be the first item, and then office will come toward the end of the year. So it'll be parks and ADU, parks and ADU. That works a lot better for getting materials out if you're balancing 2 projects like that.
Great. Commissioner Van der Laan.
Just a question, can we get, or will we get a updated map when it's final?
Absolutely. Right.
Very handy to be able to refer to.
Right. Yes, we can even now send out the link, right? Can we? No, because it's through Google Earth. We could do the PDF.
If you use KMZ files in Google Earth, you can just open the file in Google Earth, and that's one way. Or we can make a PDF.
Thank you.
We could do both.
Could have options, okay.
Can we just go back and confirm our calendar? What I'm hearing is we canceled the February 5th meeting.
Correct.
Our regularly scheduled meeting for February 19th is actually going to take place on the 26th.
Correct.
And then we are also going to do a meeting on March 5th.
Correct.
Do we have to do anything official to move our regularly scheduled meeting in March? Because we have that short course,
So
So we're
the-
adding a meeting on the 26th?
adding a meeting.
And is that
Correct.
the public hearing?
That is targeted for the public hearing.
Okay, so,
Right, and again, we're not there yet. You have a couple more
may-
meetings to make
right.
sure you're comfortable with the recommendation, and then we will schedule the public hearing.
okay. Okay, thank you.
So on February 26th, you'll bring back the whole package?
No,
Lori?
on February 26th, it's going to be the last amendments.
Oh, I'm
That's
sorry.
the
Okay,
goal.
so March 5th will be the final.
March 5th.
Yes, I believe those are the FEMA
Okay,
changes on
gotcha.
the 26th.
Okay.
And then the final packet will be
Gotcha.
the next meeting.
Right,
Thank you.
right. So then if you give your blessing on March 5th to the whole packet, then that gives us a good amount of time to do public notice and make sure everyone's aware and schedule the hearing on the 26th.
Okay. Okay, any other items for city staff and Amy to bring up? You guys good? Anything else from our colleagues here?
We just appreciate the work you do. It's a lot of details.
Yes,
So thank you both.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we'll adjourn this meeting. Thank you.